December 19, 1966. The Tonight Show was taped at NBC Studios in Burbank, California, recorded in the early evening, and broadcast that same night at 11:30 Eastern Time. Johnny Carson had been hosting for 3 years. He was 31 episodes deep into his 4th season, and already the most powerful man in late-night television. The show had become something more than entertainment by then. It was the place where America went to take the temperature of itself. If you appeared on that couch, you had arrived. And if something real happened on that couch, the whole country felt it at once. George Carlin was 29 years old that December. He was not yet the revolutionary comedian the world would come to know. The counterculture Carlin, the 7 words Carlin, the man who would one day stand on a stage and dismantle every comfortable assumption in the American mind with surgical precision and no apology. That version of him had not fully emerged. Yet. In 1966, he was still wearing a suit and tie. His hair was still short. He was funny, yes, brilliantly funny, but he was performing inside the lines, navigating the expectations of the industry, trying to figure out whether the person he was becoming would be allowed to exist on television. He had appeared on The Tonight Show before. Carson liked him. The audience liked him. But something was grinding inside Carlin that year. A restlessness he could not name. A feeling that the material he was delivering was funny in the way a clean hotel room is comfortable, adequate, inoffensive, and completely empty of anything true. And Steve McQueen was 36 years old and at the very peak of his powers. The Great Escape had come out 3 years earlier and turned him into something beyond a movie star. He was a symbol. The cool American. The man who needed no one. The man who trusted machines more than people and moved through the world on his own terms, or not at all. Bullitt was still 2 years away, but his reputation had already outpaced every film he had made. When Steve McQueen walked into a room, people stopped. Not because of what he said, often because of what he refused to say. He was scheduled for The Tonight Show that December to promote The Sand Pebbles, a serious film, a war film, a film that showed a side of McQueen that made studio executives nervous because it suggested he had feelings. Real ones, the kind that could not be outrun on a motorcycle. What the producers had not planned was what happened in the green room at 4:40 in the afternoon, 90 minutes before the taping began.
I often see comments from people who did not realize they were not subscribed. If you enjoy the channel, please take a second to check and make sure you are subscribed. It is free, and it really helps us keep the show growing. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.
But that part of the story has to wait. Because first, you need to understand something about that Tuesday in December that neither man had spoken about publicly before that night. Something that made the air between them in that green room thicker than it should have been between 2 strangers. They were not strangers. George Carlin had spent time at Camp Lejeune in the early 60s, doing his military service. Steve McQueen had his own complicated history with the military, a stint in the Marines in the early 50s that had shaped the way he carried himself for the rest of his life. They had crossed paths once, briefly, at a USO show in 1961, neither man famous yet, both of them at the beginning of something they could not quite see the shape of. Carlin had done a short set. McQueen had watched from the back of the room. Afterward, standing outside in the Carolina dark, they had talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular and everything that mattered, about where they were from, about what they were trying to become, about the feeling, shared but unspoken between them, that the lives they were supposed to want did not fit the way lives were supposed to fit. They had not seen each other since. 5 years later, they were both in a green room in Burbank, California, and the moment Carlin walked through the door and saw McQueen sitting in the leather chair with his legs crossed and his jaw set in that familiar way, something shifted. McQueen looked up. His expression did not change, but his eyes did. And And Carlin, who had spent his entire career learning to read the thing underneath what people show you, saw it immediately. He remembered him. Stay with this story, because what these two men said to each other before the cameras ever rolled is the part that has never been told. And it is the reason everything that happened on that stage meant exactly what it meant. The stage manager found them still talking at 5:10. He had to remind them both that they needed to be in makeup. Neither of them moved immediately. The assistant who was there that evening, a 22-year-old production coordinator named Dennis Ahern, who would go on to work in television for 30 more years, later said he had never seen anything like it. The two men who looked like they were finishing a conversation they had started somewhere else entirely, like they had been interrupted 5 years ago and were only now getting back to the real subject. What were they talking about? Ahern said he only caught pieces of it. But the pieces he caught stayed with him. McQueen was talking about the sand pebbles, not the way a movie star promotes a film, but the way a man talks about something that cost him something. He had spent 9 months on location in Taiwan and Hong Kong, and it had changed him in ways he was still trying to understand. The character he played, Jake Holman, a Navy machinist who trusts his engine room more than any human being alive, had gotten under his skin in a way no role ever had before. There was something in that character, McQueen said, that he recognized. A man who had learned to keep the world at a distance because closeness was a kind of danger he had never figured out how to survive. Carlin listened. Then he said something that made McQueen go quiet. "I know that guy. I grew up with that guy. He is every man who ever convinced himself that not needing anyone was the same thing as being free." McQueen looked at him. A long look, the kind that happens when someone has just handed you back something you did not know you had dropped. And then he said quietly, "Yeah. That is right." That was the moment. Not on camera, not in front of 30 million people, but in a green room in Burbank, 90 minutes before the tape rolled, between two men who had met once in the dark, outside a military base, and then spent 5 years becoming famous for being exactly what they had talked about back then. One of them was becoming famous for speaking the truth in disguise. The other was becoming famous for being a kind of truth himself, a physical argument for the idea that a man could exist on his own terms. Now here is where everything changes. Keep watching. The taping began at 5:30 exactly. Johnny's monologue that December evening was sharp and seasonal. He made jokes about Christmas shopping and the cost of everything. He made a joke about the draft. The audience laughed in the way audiences laughed in 1966, a little nervous at the edges, aware that the world outside the studio was moving faster than anyone was comfortable admitting. Vietnam was accelerating. The counterculture was beginning to find its voice. Something was coming, and everybody could feel it, even if nobody had named it yet. George Carlin was the first guest out. He sat down across from Johnny and delivered a set that was, by any measure, excellent. Clean, sharp, perfectly constructed. The audience was delighted. Johnny laughed in that genuine way he had, the way that told you a joke had actually gotten through the professional surface and landed somewhere real. And when the bit was done and the applause came down, Johnny leaned forward and did what he always did with guests he genuinely liked. He tried to find the person underneath the performance. "So, George, you have been doing this for a few years now. Is this what you thought it would be?" The question was meant to be easy. It was the kind of question that invites a charming answer about hard work paying off and the dream coming true. The machinery of The Tonight Show was built for exactly that exchange. But Carlin paused, just a half-beat longer than the format expected. And then he said, "Honestly? No, I thought I would be saying more of what I actually think by now." The studio did not go silent. The audience did not gasp. It was not that kind of moment yet. But Johnny's pen, which he had been clicking rhythmically against his notepad the way he did throughout every interview, stopped. And in the monitor in the control room, the director leaned slightly forward in his chair. Johnny said, "What do you mean by that?" Carlin smiled the way a man smiles when he has said more than he intended and is deciding whether to back away from it or walk all the way through. "I mean," he said, "I am very good at being funny in a way that makes people comfortable. But I am starting to wonder if comfortable is what comedy is actually for." Johnny looked at him. Then he said something that opened the door even wider. He said, "Do you think something is getting in the way?" And here is where Carlin did the thing that would echo through that December broadcast and into the years that followed. He turned slightly in his chair, glanced at Steve McQueen sitting 3 feet away on the same couch, and then turned back to Johnny and said, "I think we spend a lot of time being impressive instead of being honest. And impressive is a very good way to make sure no one ever actually knows you." He was not looking at McQueen when he said it. He did not have to. Because the camera caught it anyway, the slight shift in McQueen's expression. Not offense, not defensiveness. Something quieter and more unnerving than either of those things. Recognition. The audience laughed, because it was the kind of sentence that sounds like a joke on the surface. But Johnny had been doing this long enough to know when a laugh was covering something. He glanced at McQueen. McQueen met his eyes. And then McQueen did the thing that nobody watching at home that night expected from the coolest man in American cinema. He said, "He is talking about me." Not angrily. Not as an accusation. Just as a statement of fact delivered in that flat, unhurried McQueen voice that carried the full weight of a man who had spent years being too proud to admit what he actually felt. The studio went completely still. Johnny Carson set down his pen. Subscribe right now, because what happens next in this studio is the reason this broadcast has been talked about by everyone who saw it for the next 50 years. Drop your location in the comments, and you are going to want to be part of this one. Steve McQueen was not a man who explained himself. His entire public persona was built on the principle that explanation was weakness. He gave interviews the way he raced cars, fast, precise, and only on terrain he had already mapped. He did not ramble. He did not reveal. He had made himself into an image so complete and so compelling that the image had become more famous than the man wearing it. But something had happened to Steve McQueen in the 9 months he spent filming the Sand Pebbles. Something he had not been able to close back up when the cameras stopped rolling. His director, Robert Wise, had understood something about McQueen that most people around him had missed entirely. That underneath the physical courage, underneath the competitive ferocity, and the solitary cool, there was a man who had been genuinely lonely for a very long time, who had grown up in ways that had made trust feel like a kind of trap, whose instinct in every relationship, professional and personal, was to maintain the distance that kept him safe and left him alone. Jake Holman was that man, and McQueen had played him for 9 months, had lived inside that loneliness on screen every day, and at a certain point, the performance and the reality had become difficult to separate. He had come to The Tonight Show to talk about the film, but sitting on that couch in December of 1966, with George Carlin's sentence hanging in the air and 30 million people watching, something shifted. The same thing that had shifted in the green room 90 minutes earlier, when Carlin had handed him back the sentence about freedom and distance, on something that did not have a name in the language McQueen usually used. He said, "I have been playing a version of myself in movies for 6 years." He paused. "Everyone thinks they know who that guy is. He's cool. He does not need anything. He moves faster than his problems." He looked down at his hands for a moment, then back up. That is a good character. I understand why people like him. But I have been inside that character for a long time, and sometimes I am not sure anymore where the character ends. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when something real has been said in a room full of people, and everyone needs a moment to understand what they just heard. Johnny, who had interviewed every kind of person imaginable, who had the most finely calibrated instinct in television for when to push and when to simply be present, said nothing for 4 full seconds. He just looked at McQueen, and then he said, "Do you want it to end? The character, I mean. Do you want people to see something different?" And here is where the evening turned into something nobody in that studio had planned for. McQueen was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the cameras shifted, long enough that Ed McMahon, who had seen every variety of guests that show had produced, later said he thought McQueen was going to stand up and walk off. Instead, McQueen looked across at Carlin and said something that had nothing to do with promoting a film and everything to do with a conversation that had started 5 years earlier outside a USO tent in North Carolina. He said, "George told me something earlier tonight. He said that keeping people at a distance is a way of pretending you are free when what you actually are is afraid. And I have been thinking about it since he said it. And I think he is right." Carlin looked at him with the expression of a man who does not entirely know what to do with the fact that he has just been quoted seriously. He said, "I did not mean to diagnose you." McQueen almost smiled. "No," he said, "but you did anyway." The audience laughed, but it was a different laugh than the ones that had come before. It was the laugh that happens when funny and true arrive at exactly the same moment, and the room does not know which one to honor first, so it honors both. Johnny leaned back in his chair, which was his signal that he was settling in for something longer than the format required. He looked at both of them and said, "Do either of you know how unusual this is?" He gestured between them. 2 men sitting on a couch on television telling the truth about themselves without anyone asking them to. Carlin said, "That is what makes it unusual." Nobody asked. What you are about to hear is the part that people who watched this broadcast in their living rooms on December 19th, 1966, never forgot. The part that was never clipped and shown on any compilation, because it did not reduce well to 90 seconds, because it needed all the minutes it took to happen. Johnny turned to McQueen and said, "The film is about a man who cannot connect, who has decided that the safest thing is to be essential to a machine instead of essential to a person." He paused. "Is that a character you understand from the inside?" McQueen did not answer right away. He looked at the camera once, then back at Johnny. Then he said, "I grew up without a father. Was in reform school by the time I was 9. The Marines straightened something out in me, but they also finished a job that had already been started, which was teaching me that depending on other people is how you get hurt." He was speaking carefully, not with the caution of a man protecting an image, but with the caution of a man who is handling something fragile that he does not usually take out of its case. He said, "I have been fast my whole life, on screen, on a track, on a motorcycle. Moving fast is the one thing that has always felt like honesty to me, because when you are moving that fast, you cannot pretend. You are just you and the speed and what happens next." Carlin said quietly, "And when you stop moving?" McQueen looked at him. Then he said, "That is what the movie is about." And that was the moment. Not a dramatic confession, not a breakdown, not a revelation delivered in tears. Just 2 men, one of them famous for saying the thing underneath the thing, and one of them famous for being a thing so complete it left no room for the underneath, finding each other in front of 30 million people and briefly, without ceremony, telling the truth. Johnny Carson did something he almost never did. He let the silence that followed that sentence exist. He did not fill it with a joke. He did not redirect to the next segment. He simply let it sit there in the studio like something that had earned its space. Do not go anywhere. because the way this night ended is something neither of them ever discussed in public. And it is the most important part. After the taping wrapped and the studio lights went cold, the crew began their usual breakdown. Cables pulled, cameras repositioned, audience filing out into the December night. Johnny had 3 more tapings before Christmas and a pile of paperwork waiting in his office. He should have been moving, but he stayed at his desk for a few minutes longer than usual, straightening things that did not need to be straightened. What he was actually doing was watching George Carlin and Steve McQueen at the edge of the stage. They were not having a dramatic conversation. They were not embracing like men who had just shared something profound. They were standing about 3 feet apart, talking the way men talk when they are winding something down and do not quite want to let it finish. Carlin was laughing at something. McQueen had his hands in his jacket pockets, the body language of 2 people who have just remembered what it felt like to be known by someone. The production coordinator, Dennis Ahern, walked past them on his way to shut down the camera stations and caught a fragment of what was being said. Carlin was talking about something he was working on. Not the clean material, not the suit and tie stuff, but something different. Something he had been trying to figure out how to say for a couple of years. Something about the way language gets used to keep people from understanding what is actually happening to them. McQueen was listening with the particular quality of attention he gave to things that interested him, which was total and slightly unnerving if you were not expecting it. McQueen said, "Odd, so you want to make people uncomfortable," Carlin said. "I want to make people awake. Uncomfortable is just how it feels at first." McQueen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is what a good director does. Robert Wise did that to me for 9 months. I hated it for most of it." He paused. "It was the best thing that ever happened to me professionally." Carlin looked at him. Then he said, "Do you think the film will do well?" And McQueen said something that stuck with everyone who heard it. He said, "I think it will do the kind of well that means something to the people it reaches and confuses everybody else." He almost smiled. "That is the only kind of well that interests me anymore." Carlin nodded slowly. He said, Yeah, I know exactly what you mean." They shook hands outside the studio door at 7:45 that evening, and Steve McQueen got into a car and was driven to a hotel in West Hollywood. George Carlin caught a cab back to an apartment in Burbank, where he was staying during the run of shows he had booked for that week. Neither of them knew, standing there in the December cold of that Burbank parking lot, what the next 5 years were going to look like for either of them. McQueen had Bullet ahead of him. He had the French Connection and Le Mans, and a motorcycle he would ride so hard across the hills above Los Angeles that his friends would stop asking when he was going to slow down. He had 3 more years of being the coolest man in the world, and then the world would change so fast around him that cool would become something smaller than it had been, and he would spend the decade after that trying to figure out how to be something more. And Carlin had a revolution ahead of him. He had the moment, still a few years away, when he would take off the suit and tie and step out from behind the performance he had been giving and become the most honest comedian of his generation. The man who said what everyone knew and nobody said. The man who found the laugh inside the thing you were not supposed to name. He was already halfway there on December 19th, 1966, sitting on a couch in Burbank next to Steve McQueen, saying that impressive and honest are not the same thing, and that most people pick impressive every time, because honest is terrifying. Subscribe right now so you do not miss the next story. Because what happened to both of these men in the years that followed connects directly to what they said in that studio. And it is a connection that tells you everything about what it costs to finally stop performing and start being real. Drop your location in the comments. People are watching from everywhere in the world tonight. The Sand Pebbles was nominated for 8 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. Steve McQueen received his only Academy Award nomination for Best Actor for that film. He did not win. he would never be nominated again. In later years, he said, almost without bitterness, that the Academy was not especially interested in the kind of performance that required a man to actually feel something. Whether that was true or not, it was a very McQueen thing to believe. George Carlin spent the next 4 years finishing the process of becoming himself. By 1970, he had shed the suit and the clean material entirely. He grew his hair. He started saying the things he had been circling for years. His career nearly collapsed in the transition and then exploded into something far larger and more lasting than anything the 1966 version of him could have imagined. He later described that period as the years when he stopped being funny at things and started being honest about them. The difference, he said, was everything. The Tonight Show broadcast of December 19th, 1966, was not a landmark evening in the way that some of the show's most famous nights were. Nobody broke down. Nobody made a confession that changed public conversation. What happened was quieter than that, and in some ways more lasting. 2 men sat on a couch and for approximately 11 minutes said true things about themselves without having planned to. They acknowledged the distance between who they were and who they appeared to be. They did it because something in the room, the presence of each other, the memory of a conversation 5 years earlier in the Carolina dark, made it feel briefly possible. Johnny Carson never discussed that taping extensively in interviews, but those who knew him well said he referenced it occasionally in private, not as a dramatic memory, but as an example of the thing he found most valuable about the work he did. The moments when people arrived planning to perform and ended up, despite themselves, telling the truth. When the space the show created became something larger than promotion and image management and the smooth machinery of celebrity. When 2 people sat in front of a camera and briefly, without ceremony, became visible. He said once, unto a friend who repeated it years later, that the best nights on the show were the ones where something got said that wasn't supposed to get said. Not in a scandal sense, in the sense of something real breaking through. He said those nights reminded him why it was worth doing 30 years of television, because every once in a while the performance stops and the person shows up instead. And when that happens, you realize that is what everyone in that room was waiting for the whole time. Not the act, not the image, just the person. George Carlin and Steve McQueen never worked together. They were not close friends in any sustained sense. But people who knew both of them in the years after 1966 said there was a particular quality to the way each of them spoke about that evening when the subject came up, not with sentiment, not with the exaggerated warmth of nostalgia, but with the quiet recognition of a man who remembers a specific night when something honest happened in a room full of people and nobody tried to stop it. That is rare enough to be worth remembering. It is rare enough to be worth saying out loud. If this story reached something in you, subscribe to this channel right now. We tell the stories behind the moments, the conversations that happened before the cameras rolled, and the silences that meant more than anything that was said. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the real version of a person is always more interesting than the version they perform. And tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight. Because this story is reaching people everywhere, and I want to know where the truth still lands. Because here is what December 19th, 1966 actually was. It was a Monday night in Burbank, and 2 men who had met once in the dark, outside a military base, sat down in front of America and remembered, briefly, that being known is not the same thing as being famous, that honesty is not the same thing as impressive, and that sometimes the most important things get said not because the moment demands it, but because somewhere in the room, someone you met 5 years ago is listening, and you find, to your own surprise, that you still want to tell the truth.